good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. My name is Kelly Nichol, and I am the president of the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health. Some of you may have seen the report that we commissioned by IOSH on the Safe and Healthy Future of Work by Arup. It poses questions, future thinking on where the OSH profession may be going, with calls to action not just for businesses, but leaders, governments, and us, the OSH professionals. It poses a fundamental question. Are we living through a rapid time of evolution or a more fundamental revolution? As well as imagining future scenarios in which the skills of safety and health professionals will be challenged, it indicates ways in which we may, with the right development, meet such challenges. And to pose those challenges further, IOSH spoke to specialists in the fields of climate change, AI and tech, mental health, and we're also going to be looking at the gig economy. Let's see what these specialists have to say.
What I've realized is that it's no longer a future event. You know, climate change is here. We're already seeing the real world consequences of that.
I don't think that you can rely on all employers to do the right thing when it comes to mental health. And when rules were first introduced about child labour, there were some employers who pushed against that and said that it would interfere with the freeness of the market.
There is much more economic pressure, and safety is always, unfortunately, impacted by poor economics.
So if there's 1.7 million workers in that gig economy in the UK last year, it's expected to rise by 300% by 2027.
New technologies are, of course, going to make us extremely vulnerable to third-party incidents because, unfortunately, there's just bad actors out there when it comes to technology.
We can see the change. It's subtle, but it is happening. And the truth is, climate change doesn't care about governments or borders or businesses.
If they'd grown up in a different generation, they would have a different relationship with their mental health, which might have benefited them.
From what we will experience in terms of increased heat, perhaps UV exposure, skin cancer for workers that we have outside, that's huge.
So we've seen that they might not necessarily get training that other employees will get. They might not necessarily get the information, the instruction, risk assessment, and those traditional health and safety protections.
Monitoring technologies like cameras and location tracking, GPS, for example, have significant benefits for workplace health and safety, but they also have the potential to introduce significant unintended consequences. And a lot of this has to do with micromanagement and big brother approach to how these technologies are implemented by our workplaces.
What we're saying actually is that let's look at all workers as workers, and let's just make sure they've got the same protections that all employees have so that we can support the health, the safety and their well-being. So regardless of that status, let's just make sure that there are arrangements in place.
Why are we using these technologies? And if a worker is taken along for the journey, if they're engaged early, if they're provided an opportunity to design the solution, to be participants in the selection, in the testing, in the implementation, we're going to get a far better relationship with technology and the ability to maximize those benefits and mitigate all of those unintended consequences.
What I do believe is that fundamentally we are quite intelligent professionals who are capable of figuring it out. We can solve these problems. And what we have to do is, kind of win hearts and minds, refine the comms, and just push through that resistance in organizations to a point where sustainability is everybody's job. And this is just the way we operate, and it's not even a question.
Connection is a fundamental human need, and it's really the cornerstone of everything when it comes to mental health. When you actually listen with the intention of understanding, you will find yourself saying things like, oh, I've never thought about it that way, or nothing like that has ever happened to me or anyone that I know of. What's that like? That's a far more helpful response.
If we want to improve the workplace for everyone, then we need not only to ask as low as reasonably practical, but as fair as reasonably practical. We need to think about safety from the lens of equity and inclusion and fairness, and not solely an issue of safe. Think, learn and unlearn, and be prepared to challenge your own beliefs, views, and approaches.
By asking a series of what-if questions about how things might develop, this gives all of us food for thought. As well as imagining scenarios in which the skills of safety and health professionals will be challenged, the report indicates ways in which they maybe, with the right development, meet such challenges. We've posed these questions to specialists in their fields, but before we see their responses in more detail, let's take a moment to reflect. We spoke to James Pomeroy, Global Health and Safety Environment and Quality Director for Arup. James was heavily involved in the work around IOSH's white paper on the future of work. Being in the health and safety profession for 30 years, he gives us an account of how the profession has changed.
I joined safety in the early 90s, and that was somewhere about 20 years after the Health and Safety Act had come into fruition. It was also a time that the UK was joining the European Union and taking on the six-pack and all of the changes that emerged. So when I think about the changes that I've seen in 30 years of being involved in safety, I think that they really fall into potentially 5 to 6 areas. The first of which is, I think about the nature of our role. Our role is very different now. It's actually much more strategic in terms of influence, and it's on the board agenda in a way that I couldn't have envisaged when I started my career. I think the scope and the nature of the risks and opportunities that we advise on are much more varied. When I started, I was being trained on machinery guarding. I even had training in mine safety because we still have mines at that point in time. But now when I think about it, we're talking about well-being, we're talking about health, and much more about sustainability. There's also a recognition of wider business risks and how those business risks impact upon safety. I think thirdly, there's a recognition of the importance of safety in a way that hadn't necessarily been there before. When I think about early on in my career, it's very much a procedural, a compliance issue. It is much more an issue of governance, seen as a strategic risk, and it's also seen as a human right, an issue of dignity at work. I couldn't have dreamed of having those sorts of conversations years ago. I also think there's been a change in beliefs. What we believe as professionals and also as individuals changes as we go through life. Many of the things that I was taught early on in my career, I no longer believe, and the profession equally questions. So there's an emergence of what we think and believe and how we keep people safe. And finally, I think there's an issue of complexity. The world that we work in now is a world where safety is impacted much more by the world around it, whether that's trade agreements, the ability to move beyond borders, the people that work in our workplace and the cultures and nationalities, but also the types of risks that we're involved in. We're talking about issues about health and well-being, about sustainability, about the nature of strategic risks and how they impact safety. So there's been much more complexity, much more than perhaps the simple world that I started with 30 years ago.
Our role has changed significantly. I've seen it within my own 17-year career. As the nature of work changes, the nature of our profession changes. And we need to not only keep up to date, but keep ahead of risks to be able to proactively manage these for the people that we look after. The biggest challenge affecting all of us today is social and environmental. So what if extreme global warming leads to the significant increases in workers' occupational health and vulnerability? Climate change is affecting every single one of us. Climate adaptation is falling into the OSH remit. Extreme weather events, hotter weather means exposure to tropical diseases for those of us that have never experienced them before, and adaptation means changes to workers' welfare. So let's hear from someone who's got a really grounded and insightful take on climate and safety. Tama is an environmental consultant with a biology, psychology, and sustainability background. She's worked across industries and knows how climate change connects to the real-world challenges we face in health and safety. In this clip, Tama talks about why climate change matters to all of us and why OSH professionals are in a unique position to lead the change. Let's take a listen.
I've always fundamentally believed that environmental protection is part of protecting human health and well-being. Again, if you take it back to, the academic definition of sustainability, we talk about the triple bottom line of sustainability, this destination where people, planet, and profit are equal and equitable, and we have some balance. And the way it was described to me at university, in fact, during my first degree, was like a three-legged stool. So if you have a three-legged stool with people, planet, profit, all equal and equitable, you have a perfectly functional stool. However, if one of those legs is too long or one of those legs is too short, then the stool will topple over. It is unsustainable. And what that really highlights is, again, that interconnectedness of people, planet, and profit, that the three cannot exist in isolation. Now, I specialize in environmental management, but a lot of the businesses that I go into work with, I would typically be working with the health, safety, environmental, and quality teams, because the way businesses approach sustainability is through management systems, which are standardized to cover those three elements: health and safety, environment, and quality. And so it is falling on the responsibility of OSH professionals to navigate some really complicated environmental considerations. So it's kind of what's happening in the world, and then drawing it back to, but what does that mean on the ground for the health, safety, and well-being of our workforce and our business? Because, we're talking about critical materials, critical processes, protecting our people, protecting our resources. And if we don't, again, take that holistic triple bottom line perspective, we undermine everything. What I'm finding, though, is that a lot of health and safety professionals are getting environmental sustainability added into their job remit. And from a business perspective, it makes a lot of sense. Practically, functionally, that is the department that has the greatest ability to bring environmental management and sustainability into how the business operates. And with health and safety, having done the journey already and, so ingrained in organizational culture, it's actually a great opportunity to tap into that. I do think one of the barriers is that, education for sustainability and knowledge around sustainability and understanding some of the complexities of what we're dealing with at a global scale, that kind of knowledge gap is probably the biggest barrier at the moment. But they definitely have the fundamental skills that are necessary to progress better environmental management and better sustainability strategies. The time is critical. The next 5 years between now and 2030 really, really matter. So if we make climate change and sustainability the heart of conversations, the heart of how businesses operate, I believe we have every opportunity to slow the tide, to mitigate the worst consequences of climate change beyond that 2 degree centigrade threshold. And then we will be able to look for opportunities to now regenerate and restore the natural environment, which fundamentally will continue to keep us alive by providing clean air, clean food, and clean water. I think it's really important that we redefine what health and safety means in a modern workplace. And health and safety considers the health and safety of individuals, but should also consider the health and safety of our environment. Our care to our employees is more than slips, trips, and falls. It's about creating work that is meaningful, work that enhances the environment that surrounds us, and fundamentally seeking to protect those most fundamental needs for humans, and also making sure that we create a future ready and resilient workforce for some of the challenges we might still face in the future.
Climate change is a workplace risk. Extreme heat, supply chain disruptions are already impacting worker safety and business continuity. Our roles as health and safety professionals are expanding. We're now expected to integrate environmental sustainability within our own responsibilities. And applying traditional OSH risk assessment methods to climate-related challenges can help businesses adapt and protect workers, and we are best suited to use those tools. And modern health and safety has to include climate resilience, mental well-being, and equity, not just physical hazards. Which brings us very nicely onto mental health. There is a need for broader action on well-being, and I am going to disagree with my esteemed colleague who mentioned earlier the importance of measuring the impact of mental health. If we have to teach our businesses that it is important to be kind and to support our employees, we are already on to a loser. In today's workplaces, mental health is no longer a side conversation. It is a safety issue. As health and safety professionals, we are trained to prevent harm, reduce risk, and protect well-being. But what happens when that harm is invisible? In this clip, mental health campaigner and broadcaster Natasha Devon shares a powerful perspective on why mental health deserves the same regulatory attention as physical health and what we can do about it.
It's so interesting because the first thing any mental health professional will tell you about self-diagnosis is don't do it. And yet the services aren't there, which leaves many people, I think there are about 6 million people as we sit here who are currently waiting for NHS psychological services. The waiting list can be anything from 2 weeks, if you're extremely lucky, to 2 years, which is actually a more normal experience. There are all these people who are suffering and of course are seeking answers elsewhere because they're not able to access the services. So to a degree, as an employer, you have to engage with people's self-diagnosis, even if they don't have a certificate or a piece of paper to prove it. I would be very wary of going down a route where we measure success in mental health in the workplace by people's symptoms and experiences. This is something that I was very concerned about with Ofsted inspections in schools, in fact, because what that does then is it incentivizes the schools not to allow pupils to disclose, because the more mental health issues they have within their cohort, the less successful they're seen to be as a school. And the same thing could happen in workplaces. So rather than focusing on what employees are experiencing, the focus should instead be on how employers are supporting anybody who might be experiencing those symptoms. I don't think that you can rely on all employers to do the right thing when it comes to mental health. And history teaches you that when rules were first introduced about child labour, there were some employers who pushed against that and said that it would interfere with the freeness of the market. And you will always have employers who are like that, just as you will always have employers who get it and understand how important it is and invest. So I do think that there needs to be some kind of legislation, some kind of government interference. As somebody who I'm co-founder of a campaign called Where's Your Head At? And we are asking for parity between physical and mental health first aid in the workplace. Very simple. If you have a physical health first aider and you are required to do so by law in your workplace, there should be an equal and opposite mental health first aider, and just as many. However many physical you're required to have, you should have the same number of mental. And we were pushing for that because it was a really simple way to introduce some kind of parity. And yet the pushback against it was people saying, well, this isn't going to solve all mental health issues in the workplace. And we never claimed that it would, nor would we ever say that it would. But the perception seemed to be that that would become a flaw because employers would think, well, that's all I have to do, and I don't have to give any more support to my employees. I definitely think that different generations have something to teach each other, and it would be wonderful if they all recognize that and had these conversations. What I will say is that, my experience of working with people who are in their early 20s now is that if you are displaying attitudes or using language that they consider to be unacceptable, they probably won't challenge you on it because the chances are that you'll be more senior or more experienced than them, but they will talk about it behind your back. So it's better, I think, to know and to go in with genuine curiosity to the conversation and ask them, where they're at with things like language. But I think there is a big fear or a perception that you can't say anything to young people that is so unhelpful, because connection is a fundamental human need, and it's really the cornerstone of everything when it comes to mental health. I think the best thing that all employers can do is try to anonymize the feedback process when it comes to how they can improve, because particularly with mental health, I think still a lot of people understand theoretically that it's okay to disclose their mental health challenges, but think in practice they will be seen as incompetent or not able to handle the workload, or that it's going to frustrate their career progression in some way. And then certainly when it comes to suggestions of how management can improve or how the workplace environment can be improved, a lot of people, particularly women, don't want to be seen as difficult in the workplace, so won't express those. If you find a way to genuinely anonymize it so people can submit their feedback and you don't know who it's coming from, you will get such helpful suggestions. And in my experience, you will be surprised by how time and cost effective some of those are.
I'm not going to summarize the key points. You can see them all there. But what I will say is that mental health affects everybody. As Natasha reminds us, every single one of us has got a head, right? It is time to move beyond awareness and into action. Whether it's mental health first aid, anonymous feedback, or just simply creating a space for empathy and connection, every step counts. We are moving now onto technology and digitalization. So what if the application of technologies improves worker protection and it creates other health, safety, and well-being risks? More and more tasks and jobs are becoming automated, and this is reshaping the work that we do. As safety professionals, we're often excited by the potential of new technologies to reduce harm and protect workers. But what if those very tools introduce new risks themselves, ones that we are not yet prepared for? What if the application of technologies to improve worker protection creates other health, safety, and well-being risks? Some predict that up to 81% of tasks will be automatable through AI. We posed this to safety technology specialist who was here and has had to run away to go and get his flight home, and chartered fellow of IOSH, Cam Stevens. Cam, hopefully, gives us an insight into the considerations we need to make in new tech. Let's take a look.
Well, all digital technologies have cybersecurity risk, And artificial intelligence technologies in particular have new threats to our organizations. A really good example of that is deepfakes, things like synthetic voice cloning, where an organization might, an employee might get a phone call from what they think is their manager asking them for some sensitive information, which they would normally divulge. But in this case, it might be actually a synthetic voice asking for that. So there are some really creative ways that bad actors are trying to penetrate organizations from a cyber perspective. And just like we need to manage health and safety risks by understanding the threats and identifying controls, we have to do that with cybersecurity risk as well. So it's not that we shouldn't be using these technologies. We have to be really understanding this new threat profile, this new risk profile, and coming up with just as creative ways to mitigate these risks as these bad actors are to try and get past our cybersecurity. There are absolutely use cases where machines outperform humans time and time again. A good example of that is using computer vision, machine learning, artificial intelligence for cancer cell diagnosis as a real classic example. But what these machines can't do is to have that human context, the human analysis, those critical empathy type skills that are needed to be able to pull together a lot of different disparate data sets and make sense of that. So right now, it is absolutely about determining which use cases are better for machines to be taking the lead and which use cases are better for humans to be taking the lead. And this is not about and or, so humans or machines. It's about humans plus machines better together. AI automation in our workplaces will absolutely bring new risks to our enterprise. And what we need to appreciate here is a lot of those new risks are likely to be psychosocial risks. So physical risks get reduced by large-scale automation, particularly AI-based automation, but we're also now changing the paradigm and the nature of how work is performed through AI-assisted automation. And therefore, we have to be very clear about how these risks are coming into our organizations and what risk controls we need to put in place to mitigate those not really unintended, they should be forecastable risks that are coming into our business. It's up to us as health and safety professionals to forecast what those risks are going to be, to clearly understand them, and to put risk controls in place before we get those unintended consequences occur. So what got us to where we are won't get us to where we need to in the future. There are so many new opportunities to control risks with the application of new technologies, but these new technologies also bring new risks with those to the business. So as health and safety professionals, we need to look at ourselves as agents of change in the future of work, to anticipate these new risks, to understand that a lot of these new risks will be psychosocial in nature. We have to be curious, experiment, explore this modern working world, and take charge and thrive in the future of work.
Professionals like us need to be at the table for discussions about digital and technological interventions so that we can advocate for safety in design and worker-centered approaches. We must consider what model of regulation and enforcement will be required to harness the benefits of these developments whilst protecting people, standards, and our environment. So, we know the OSH role is changing. There are so many new considerations within the window of OSH, and in this next segment, we're going to come back to James Pomeroy, who makes it clear that doing things the way we always have just won't cut it. We are not just managing risks, we are navigating a whole new world of work. So let's hear what he has to say.
If we want to improve the workplace for everyone, then we need not only to ask as low as reasonably practical, but as fair as reasonably practical. We need to think about safety from the lens of equity and inclusion and fairness, and not solely an issue of safe. We also need to ask who's making those judgments on safety and how much we involve those who are affected by the decision making. Think, learn and unlearn, and be prepared to challenge your own beliefs, views, and approaches.
I love that last line. Learn, unlearn, relearn. The profession must adapt or risk becoming obsolete, like parts of the quality sector. Serious injuries and fatalities remain stubbornly high, and this must stay our top priority. Challenge our outdated beliefs. We must stay agile in fast-changing worlds, and we need to look outside safety, borrow from other fields, marketing, operations, and tech to innovate and stay relevant. This gives us some calls to actions, not just for businesses and employers, but for the OSH profession as a whole. IOSH urges businesses to align with the UN Sustainable Development Goals for enhanced social sustainability through strong OSH practices. It emphasizes the need for inclusive workforces that protect vulnerable groups and address diverse OSH needs. And it calls for identification and management of existing and emerging OSH risks through our supply chains, including our small suppliers. For our profession, we're encouraged to understand the changes highlighted within this report. We're expected to promote safety in design and human-centric approaches to protect and nurture our workers. And we need to develop additional skills to become invaluable to our organizations and support social sustainability and ethical practices. As professionals, the challenge ahead isn't just about new tools. It's about evolving how we think, how we learn, and how we lead in a complex world of work. And if that has whet your appetite, please take a sec. I'll leave this up for as long as I can. Please take a second to have a look and make use of the QR code to download the full report. And I hope that this has given you some thoughts, given you some takeaways, and will enable you to have some pretty significant discussions within yourselves as a community and within your own businesses. Thank you very much.